The great pleasure of tonight is that I'm allowed to chair the session with the actual chair of this seminar, Lavinia Greenlaw. And it is an exciting and slightly daunting task, only in the sense that Lavinia is a writer of many hues and forms. She has published 5 volumes of poetry, 2 novels. She has written different volumes of non-fiction, a libretto for Peter Pan, which was performed at the Komische Oper in Berlin, or is it still on? Or will be, slightly ahead of our time here. She's done things like sound work for an audio obscura, which is like a camera obscura for your ears. Incredible. She's done radio documentaries on a wide range of subjects, from the Arctic to the darkest place in England. And of course, she's written many essays, again, ranging from Bob Dylan to 17th century wonder. It is a wide range, and at the same time, you always say that poetry is the center of your work. And what we'll do is we'll work our way from the outer layers of your work into what probably still is the center for you. And to start, we could talk about a book that you published in 2007 with the wonderful title of The Importance of Music to Girls, which has a wonderful sort of almost schoolmarmish ring to it. It's an educational piece of work. It isn't, of course, but it makes you feel, now what can I take away from this task? It describes a generational experience. If you were young in the 70s, any one of you will laugh and cringe and recognize what you describe. And music is the center of your descriptions. Why music and not language?
Because music has always been absolutely there beside the books. And when I was a teenager, I was listening to music and going to see bands as much as I was consuming books and trying to write. And I'd written a novel which was loosely based in my teenage terrain, which was 70s London and Essex, and the sort of coming of disco and then punk rock. And I thought I want to write more about the music as agency of experience, really, and how it leads us into things and fools us about them and saves us, and all those things. So it's not just about pop music, it's about playing the piano, it's about being given a radio, it's about music in every sense.
I also was struck by the way that it's music as something that you do. So you were singing, you were in a choir.
Oh no, the choir was my mother's magical choir. In fact, my publishers were very cross because after they published the book, they found out I'd been in a band, and I hadn't, and I skipped those years because I felt that was a sort of other thing somehow. It's very strange. So the thing about being in a band and making a record was entirely kind of excised because it was a book about me, playing the piano, but essentially receiving other people's music. It wasn't about me as someone who makes music.
At the same time, it's also very much about the physical experience of music through dance.
Yeah.
And
dance.
Obviously, disco dancing comes to mind, but also before that, you were forced into English country dancing.
Oh, Cecil Sharp House, yes. Yes, I think the sort of mortifications of heel and toe and stripping the willow when you're kind of old enough to have a sense this is not what you want to see what people see you doing. I had to wear a green sprigged skirt and a scratchy lace blouse, and yes. But later on, I loved Cayley's, and I sort of was glad I'd learnt.
You make a very interesting remark about English country dancing being so nice, whereas Scottish country dancing is about they were dancing with swords.
Yeah.
So would you?
But it was just, I mean, I used talking about my country dancing as a way of exploring. I mean, I grew up in North London, and all my friends had, they had an identity of different kinds. They were from Mauritius or from Japan, or they were Catholic, or they were Jewish. And I was kind of your down the road British mongrel, really, with no strong characteristics. And all I could say was, well, my grandparents are Scottish, Irish, and Welsh, but I didn't feel I was those things. And the country dancing that we did was so nice. And I just thought, and then I'd see Irish dancing and they swords, or Scottish dancing with swords, or Irish dancing when there's that incredible tension in the upper body. And I wanted some kind of tension, actually, that I wasn't getting.
Another aspect that becomes very clear when you write about this very generational experience is that you come from what the Germans would call a Bildungsbürgerhaushalt, so educated, middle-class people of a scientific bent mostly, but you seem to have been exposed to, going to concerts, music, classical music, pop music. Was that a very conscious thing, or did that just sort of happen or float around?
No, I mean, I had no interest in classical music except that out of boredom and fury I played the piano. And that was my only engagement with classical music. My parents listened to it and went to concerts, but I didn't engage with that really unless I was made to. There's a story in here about my father taking me to my first opera, but essentially I was very much about pop music. And I was very lucky, though, that we had a house full of books, and that my father had, in the 60s, in the period my mother described as when your father tried to be swinging. And he had gone to Poetry International and the Albert Hall, and he had bought lots of Penguin European poets and lots of American poets. And I just read my way along the shelves, not knowing who anyone was, which is the best way to discuss. And that's, I'm sure, why I'm a poet, because I found that stuff on the shelves. So I was very lucky. Books and music, yeah.
The interesting thing is that in the book, the music is very dominant, and you name so many of those erratic names that you have a soundtrack in your head when you're reading it, whereas you're quite secretive about the reading.
The reading is there. Each little chapter has an epigraph from a book that was important to me in some way, and that's where I've put the reading, really, in relation to it. But I very much wanted it to be not a book about thinking. It's a book about becoming myself, and I was somebody who was not good at being a child and not good at being present, and I was finding my way through all of that, and music was a huge part of that. I was an obsessive. I would be there in the record shop and not realize I was the only girl talking about labels and digital delay and things like that, and not realizing that the boys didn't really want me to talk to them about it either. So it was a very intense presence in my life. It still is. Yeah.
At the same time, you obviously experimented with different hairstyles, lifestyles.
Glad she said hairstyles. I was quite worried.
Which, in lots of ways, is talking about different forms that you can take.
Yeah.
So, was being young being shapeless?
Yeah, it was about metamorphosis. I mean, there's this lovely thing Roberto Calasso describes in The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony when he's talking about the time of metamorphosis before life was fixed. And I quote it in here, and I think very much that the child has this sense that I could be a boy, or I could be a dog, or I could be a stone. It just feels like that's possible. And I felt so shapeless that I threw myself into forms. So I was a sort of scruffy North London kid, and got mocked at school, and 3 years later kind of flung myself into disco and hyper girl, and I was really bad at that. I was like the botched Airfix model of a girl. It was just terrible. And then I was at a loss, and then punk came along, and I thought punk was giving me a chance not to be a girl.
Did it work?
No, I don't think, I mean, it released me from all kinds of things, because aesthetics and being kind of the one who didn't belong and so on, all of that helped. And I was living out in this Essex village, spending my life in a bus shelter, and it felt like it was a sort of provincial condition, punk, so it kind of worked. But I did think in the end, I am a girl, and I can't avoid that. And
that has a wonderful tinge of sadness to it, and some of that.
I don't want to be a man, I have to say. Very happy being a woman, but it was an interesting time of unthinking mobility in the self, or fluidity or something. Yeah.
Again, the other thing that becomes very clear is that while you were experimenting with different forms, you were constantly reading and trying out new thoughts, and at the same time being ironic about it. Why is irony so attractive when
it was,
young?
I mean,
or was?
Around sort of 1978 and 79, really, there was this deadly seriousness arising in a certain kind of culture around music. So music reviews were written in a very sort of, in the context of culture and ideologies and so on, very apparently self-consciously, but at the same time there was a need to ironize constantly your own seriousness. So and it all felt very heavy, very clunky, as if we were all wearing diving suits or something. But I think it's also there is a very British unease about straightforward seriousness, particularly aesthetic seriousness. That sort of way that a desire to keep everything in a sort of semi-ironic condition. And I think I increasingly resist qualifying things with irony, try to.
Well, I guess that's part of becoming
Yes.
more sure, or understanding what you really are about.
Yeah.
Which is what we're going to talk about a bit later. Maybe
Okay.
this is a moment to
Read this.
read the extract.
I'm not sure which mic will pick me up. This is the opening of The Importance of Music to Girls, and it's called My Papas Waltz, after the Theodor Rutger poem, and there's a little quote from that about dancing as a violent form. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. I remember the dancing of my earliest years in silence, as about the body alone. My father must have hummed a tune as I stood on his shoes and he waltzed me. But what I remember are the giant steps I was suddenly making. The world rose up under one foot and pushed my body to one side as that foot set off in a high, violent arc. I didn't know if I was going to be able to follow, but at the last moment the world gathered up the rest of me. And so it went on. The world pulled and shoved while I lurched and stretched. This was not a gentle game, which was why we 4 children loved it. We liked to be thrown about by a roller coaster, slide or swing in a rough sea on a trampoline, or by grown-ups who, in moving us at their force and speed, gave us a taste of the dimensions of adult life. We had a young uncle who played less carefully than my father. He would take me by the hands and spin me like a tea cloth full of wet lettuce until I thought my arms would be wrenched from their sockets. As the pain bunched in my shoulders and my brain shrank, I was amazed that such movement was possible. I wasn't scared. I knew that I could break and had an idea of what it felt like to break, but I also knew I wasn't going to. The waltz was more interesting than other such games because its force had to be met. It depended upon the tension between trying not to move and letting yourself be moved. I trod down hard on my father's shoes, braced my arms and dug my nails into his shirt cuffs like someone finding a hold on a cliff. This is the starting point of dance. Something, the music, the steps, your partner, holds you, but you also have to hold it, and to achieve the necessary tension, hold yourself against it. A lot of my childhood was about being held back or slowed down. It took hours to leave the house, to get us all ready and to keep us ready. It was like trying to keep 4 plates spinning. Someone lost a glove or refused their coat, was cross or hungry or needed a clean nappy. We spent a lot of time waiting to be delivered or collected, for the school day to end or the night to be over. We moved in caravan formation and at the speed of camels, taking 2 days to drive the 250 miles from London to the west coast of Wales, pottering along in a pair of Morris Travellers. Once released, we were fizzy and impatient. If something was high, we climbed it and jumped off. If it was steep, we hurtled down it on cycles, sleds, or trays. We ran or rolled down any hill we came to, regardless of nettles, glass, dog shit, or stones. If the landscape filled up with rain, leaves, fog, or snow, we continued to move through it as fast as we could, not fearing what might now be concealed. Every now and then, the world gathered itself in refusal. I slammed into it and got hurt. At 4, I went down a slide, sucking on a bamboo garden cane, which hit the ground before I did. The top 2 inches jammed into the roof of my mouth, and I stood over a basin and watched it fill up with blood, feeling nothing, interested only in my sister offering a teddy bear she would not normally part with. When I woke up after the operation to remove the piece of cane, I was curious only about the coal fire opposite my bed and the taste of hospital ice cream. For a long time, this accident was just something that had happened to my mouth. Other people had to make the connections for me. That cane was lodged very close to your brain, my mother later said. We could tell you were more or less all right, but the surgeons didn't know if they could remove it without doing any damage. My brother added, it's why people shoot themselves that way. And it could have affected your speech, continued my mother, by changing the shape of the roof of your mouth. Being pushed out of shape made me realize I had a shape to return to, like my toy cat who sat on a drum and whose parts were kept in tension by elastic. If I pressed the underside of the drum, the cat fell to its knees or slumped to one side. I let go and the cat sprang to one side as if jiving. I was fascinated by the instant way it changed shape and then snapped back, and by the ambiguity of its bright little face, so eager to please and yet so imperturbable. My body had felt like that of the toy cat, an arrangement of parts. I would watch my hand touch the bar of an electric fire or my foot tread on a nail and discover that they belonged to me. I knew now that my mouth shaped my voice and that my brain was right there just above it. I saw this most clearly 30 years later on an X-ray, which showed that instead of arching back to cradle my skull, the vertebrae at the top of my spine thrust my head forward. In that accident, my head had been thrown back so abruptly that it had been compensating ever since, leaving me with the feeling of being precipitate, of tipping into rather than entering the next moment, thought, or sentence. So the body adds up, and the world reminds you of the body's limits, although it can be surprisingly kind. At 8, I jumped through a window, and I can still remember how the glass billowed and held me before it exploded. I was midair, I had escaped the person I was running from, and I was being held. Nothing has seemed as peaceful since. I stepped out of that ring of shattered glass like a corpse from a chalk silhouette and walked away with a cut on each knee. These collisions with the world taught me its substance and laws as well as my own. I had danced before I knew what my body was and did not understand what moved me. It was not music yet.